Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. My name is David Kaufman. I'm the Associate Director of the Israel and Golda Kashitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University. Our campus is located on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg peoples, and on the treated lands between the British Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I'm not sure if this theme of indigeneity will come up again during the rest of our session today, but it's here as a possible dovetail with the exciting discussion that we have ahead of us for those who are attuned to it. We're delighted to have you with us for the 2024 Leonard Wolinsky Lectures in Jewish Life and Education. We're so very grateful to the Wolinsky family for enabling us to bring you such wonderful speakers year in, year out. And we're thrilled to have two fantastic lectures lined up for you under the banner title, Returns to Sepharad, Identity and Citizenship Among Iberian Jewish Descendants, delivered by two brilliant and accomplished professors, Dalia Kandiyoti from CUNY Staten Island and Rina Benmayor from Cal State Monterey. Sephardic Jews, whose name is derived from the Hebrew word for Spain, as I'm sure you all know, are descendant from Jews from the Iberian Peninsula and are now part of a vibrant global community in Israel and the diaspora. It's been some 500 years since the expulsions and forced conversions of Jews in Spain and Portugal, but not everyone might know that these countries have made efforts to confront their past abuse of Jews in various ways, including encouraging scholarship and awareness about Sephardic Jewry and offering citizenship for a limited period to descendants of victims of their policies, so long ago though they were. The expulsion era is often seen by Jewish historians as beginning the modern era in Jewish history. It marks the start of the formation of a global network of Jews related by ancestry and shared experience. Conversos, expellees, and these returnees to Judaism all presage questions of identity that are hallmark of the modern era. Sephardic Jews and conversos are also among the earliest Jews to arrive in the Western Hemisphere. They have left a profound legacy in the Americas, as well as in those places we more commonly associate with them, North Africa and the Middle East, port cities in Northern Europe, the Balkans. Interest in Sephardi history and attention to Ladino has made significant strides in recent decades among scholars and Jewish communal bodies. These are sites of much innovative work, but much remains to be done to address the relative lack of Sephardic studies in academic Jewish studies programs, including in our own. Though we do offer one course here at York called Church, Mosque, and Synagogue in Medieval Spain, and we've held events about Sephardic Jewry in recent years, including one on the Holocaust in Greece, which you can find on our YouTube channel. Toronto and Montreal are home to unique and distinctive Sephardic cultures and communities. To folks from those communities who may be joining us this afternoon, I wish you a particularly warm welcome. Our speakers today will offer their talks back to back. Each one is around 40 minutes. When they're done, I'll come back on to help moderate a Q&A with the speakers. If you're in the audience, feel free to type up questions that you have as we go and submit them using the Q&A function on Zoom. So welcome first, Dalia Kandiyoti. You could turn your camera on. Dalia is a professor of literature and the author of the books The Converso's Return, Conversion and Sephardi History in Contemporary Literature and Culture, and Migrant Sites, America, Place, and Diaspora Literatures, as well as articles on contemporary literature and migrations, Sephardic and Latin American diasporas and experiences. With our second speaker, Professor Benmayor, Dr. Kandiyoti has conducted extensive oral histories with applicants of Sephardic origin for Spanish or Portuguese nationality, and published a volume that we'll speak about a little bit today called Reparative Citizenship for Sephardi Descendants, Returning to the Jewish Past in Spain and Portugal. She's also published numerous articles on Sephardi, Latinx, and diasporic writing. Dr. Kandiyoti co-teaches a course annually at the University of Granada in Spain, as well as in their master's program in Arabic and Hebrew cultures. Her talk is called The Sephardi Past, the Converso Present, Literature, Citizenship, and Sephardi Identity. Welcome, Dalia.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I want to thank for the invitation to, I wanted to thank Kalman, and I want to thank David for hosting, and Julie and Grant for their help in organizing and the tech work. I'll be talking about my book, The Converso's Return. And before I turn it over to Rina, I'll briefly introduce our co-edited volume, Reparative Citizenship. My book, The Converso's Return, is about a reawakening of interest in recent times of what was supposed to be a remote and buried history, the history of Jews who converted to Catholicism in medieval Spain and Portugal, and their descendants who spread on both sides of the Atlantic. The stories of these Judeo-conversos, or Jewish converts, conversos in short, also known as crypto-Jews, Christians continuing secret Jewish affiliations and practices, have been revived in recent historical works, fiction, film, and memoirs. I became more aware of them when I realized that several well-known Latina authors of New Mexican and Caribbean backgrounds whom I teach and I've written about had talked in interviews about their own crypto-Jewish backgrounds. I wanted to know more about why these Chicana, Mexican-American, Cuban-American authors, and many others I discovered turn to such histories, how they narrate them, and what meanings they attach to them. I was curious about the circumstances, purposes, and effects of engaging with such remote pasts. Just going to share my screen. Oh, okay. So as David has already mentioned, 1492 was in 1492, Jews and soon afterwards Muslims were expelled from Spain, the site of the largest Jewish community at the time, in an act that we can now call an ethno-religious cleansing to create a purely Catholic territory free of heresy. This event took place around the same time as Spain's reach widened and its persecution and exploitation of various peoples in the Americas became global. While tens of thousands of Jews left Spain and Portugal and went to Portugal and the Muslim lands of the Ottoman Empire in North Africa, many others converted to Christianity in order to be able to stay. The Jewish and Muslim conversos, those who converted in 1492 or in earlier eras of persecution, were frequently subjected to the terror of the Spanish Inquisition and also the Portuguese Inquisition, because they were suspected of heresy and dissimulation and carrying on the old religion in secret, hence of being crypto-Jewish or crypto-Muslim, a grave crime punishable by death. A similar process took place a bit later in Portugal, but it had a significant effect there too on the lives of those who had converted. Some conversos did and others did not retain pre-conversion identities or practices, but being a converso could be a very suspect category no matter what the level of one's devotion to the new religion, to Christianity. Referred to as marranos or pigs pejoratively, the conversos understandably conceal their origins as much as possible and sometimes obtained falsified blood purity certificates. Although among other bands they were also banned from the so-called New World, Jewish conversos from Spain and Portugal still crossed the Atlantic and became settlers in the Americas, hiding their new Christian status, whether or not they engaged in crypto-Jewish practices. Because of the secrecy, the main records about crypto-Jewish identities and practices in the Americas that exist are Inquisition documents. With some exceptions, the secret Jewish life of conversos and Spanish and Portuguese origins was thought to have largely disappeared in the Americas after the 17th century. For one historian, Judith Lakin Alkin, the conversos in the Americas were, quote, legally extinct and genetically submerged, unquote. Other historians like Stanley Hordes, David Gitlitz, Seth Koonin, and others have countered this claim, though controversies remain about this issue given the lack of extensive documentation. as to the presence of conversos and converso descendants in the Americas. Some narratives of Jewish provenance in the Americas were disseminated in other ways. Unlike in movies, historical secrets are not usually found in a vault, but as María Teresa Hernández argued in her book Delirio, they have an oral life of their own. Secret Judaism in the Americas, and especially its remnants in contemporary communities, became much better known in the past few decades, with a surge in crypto-Jewish identity claims in Latinx, Hispanic, United States, and in Latin America. It is this phenomenon, documented in mainstream media, but also featured in many fictional and other written narratives, that I have called the Converso's Return. The most prominent example in North America of individuals revealing or discovering their Sephardi and crypto-Jewish background has been in northern New Mexico and to a certain extent elsewhere in the southwestern United States. Many reported familial practices considered strange in their very Catholic environments, such as the lighting of Friday candles, the avoidance of pork, slaughtering practices that are reminiscent of koshering, endogamy, and a generalized sense of apartness. And some did DNA tests and traced themselves to Jewish ancestors genetically. Based on one or a number of such oral or genetic sources, individuals helped by Jewish academics and rabbis assumed Jewish identity or sought to convert to Judaism. The discourse of extinction about conversos was replaced by discourses of survival. Despite some challenges as to the veracity of the claims, such stories are now part of the culture in that region. And it's not only, and you see here the kind of children's books and other books that emerged with a distinctly New Mexican origin, but it's not only in New Mexico that this was happening. In Latin America too. Many individuals have investigated or revealed Spanish or Portuguese Jewish origins, incorporating their discoveries into their self-narratives, actively participating in communities online, writing historical fiction, making relevant art, and sometimes converting to Judaism, as we see here in the slide. And not long ago, a group of genetics researchers published a scientific paper with findings that indicate that up to tens of millions of Latin Americans have Sephardic DNA. You might have also heard about some well-known figures like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's public mentioning of her own Converso roots in 2018, though she doesn't identify as Jewish based on this family history. Often people want to know, why now? Why, after 500 years of the greatest mass conversions and expulsion, would someone from Albuquerque, New Mexico, or Nuevo León, Mexico, with a very consistent Catholic education and practice, investigate Spanish Jewish origins, and also identify with being Sephardi and even converting to Judaism? I can only address this briefly here because there's such a wide range of reasons. On the individual level, as I know from having read testimonies and conducted interviews myself, some reasons are the feeling of difference or distance from one's own religious community and a search for a different faith and belonging. Also common is a cosmopolitan sense of expansive identities where one can incorporate multiple provenances and claim various ancestral legacies, even if they seem incompatible, such as the Christian and Jewish. On a larger level, there are also other factors. One is the global memory culture of the past several decades that has recuperated buried histories and memorialized unspoken aspects of past suffering and injustices, whether of genocide, dictatorship, or expulsions. As part of this memory boom, as Andreas Huysen called it, 1992 saw the quincentenary commemorations of the 1492 expulsion, 500 years, of Jews from Spain, which took place in Spain, in Turkey, North America, and elsewhere. And it led to a lot of cultural production about and a lot of attention to Sephardic history. Here you see a slide from the Turkish celebration. It was a celebration in Turkey. It was a commemoration in Spain and elsewhere. Another part of the relevance of this ancient history today is that a scholar such as Aaron Graff-Zivin has argued the history of crypto-Jews serves as a warning about state power, as well as the consequences of eradicating coexistence, the Christian-Muslim-Jewish coexistence in the Iberian Peninsula is the reference point. In my chapter on Turkish narratives about conversos and dönmes, for example, I show how the multicultural Ottoman space is represented as a refuge in contrast to a tyrannical Spanish state. In addition to serving as an allegory of tyranny and precedent for large-scale persecution, converso history and duality, having been publicly Christian and privately and secretly Jewish, has been presented as a parallel to contemporary minority groups' assimilation in multicultural modern societies, in which certain backgrounds need to be suppressed for survival. Beyond the attraction of the converso as a figure, tens of thousands of people throughout the Americas and to a certain extent in Europe have reclaimed ancestry, as I mentioned. And some have incorporated Jewishness into their current identities. In doing so, they attest to what Marianne Hirsch and Nancy Miller explain in their book on diasporas and returns that, quote, far from waning in the 21st century, the desire for a return to origins and to sites of communal suffering has progressively intensified, end quote. Recently, the search for roots has also been intensified through genetic ancestry testing, which is now an important part of the quest for origins that have disappeared. So having explained the background for this project, let me describe the book a bit more closely. It is a study of authors writing in English, Spanish, Turkish, and French that takes into account each work's particular positioning in its own literary and cultural context, ranging from contemporary Latina USA to Spain, France, and Turkey. This variety shows the extent of interest in world literature in converso and crypto-Jewish history and descent by both Jewish and non-Jewish authors, and the overlapping and different ideas that converso history connects with. In my first chapter, I discuss wide-ranging fictional and historiographical representations of conversos in the 19th and 20th century, with the goal of providing an overview of the themes and tropes that inform the works that I examine closely in the rest of the book. Although I focus on writing in the past couple of decades, I show converso and especially Inquisition history have long been present in modern literature. Scholars such as Michael Ragusis and others have studied British, Latin American, and German writing in the 19th and 20th centuries and found many novels about ineluctable secret origins. A prime example is the Victorian novel The Vale of Cedars, or The Martyr, published in 1850 by Grace Aguilar, the remarkable English author of 12 books, who had a converso Portuguese background. So from Portugal to England was her family journey. This melodramatic novel, set in the 15th century, features Marie, who has fallen for a Catholic but cannot disavow her Jewish faith despite being tortured by the Inquisition. The association of conversos with martyrdom, the retention of faith despite the tragedy of persecution, and the tortured double life of dissimulation, disguise, and assimilation, and of course, the horrors of the Inquisition, rendered with Gothic imagery, are among the most common 19th century tropes, and to a certain extent, these tropes persist in contemporary fiction. After this overview of earlier writing, in the bulk of the book, I examine closely texts dating from the 1990s to the 21st century, starting with Kathleen Alcala, a Mexican-American author who converted to Judaism based on her converso heritage, and wrote fiction about crypto-Jews in 19th century Mexico who were hiding their identities and crossing paths and lives with indigenous people of the region. Another Latina author in the US I look at is Achille Bejas, whose novel Days of Awe is about Cuban and Cuban-American crypto-Jews in a novel framed by the Cuban exile experience. I have also a chapter on the Spanish author José Manuel Fajardo, who wrote a prize-winning novel about contemporary perspectives in Spain on conversos and Jewish, quote-unquote, Jewish blood in the Spanish national body. And I juxtapose this work with a memoir of a Jewish converso identity quest by the Costa Rican-American author and journalist Doreen Carvajal. I also examined the must-read memoirs by the French thinker Edgar Morin and the Guatemalan-American author Victor Pereira, both of whom grew up in Sephardic families of Salonican and Jerusalem origins and wrote wide-ranging works on family and the wider Sephardic story, but identified with their converso ancestors. And I look at why that is in a chapter on critical genealogies. And finally, I study fiction by two Turkish authors, Elif Shafak and Yeşim Tarnar, who connect the Spanish Jewish history of conversions and persecution, including the conversion of the Dönme or the Sabbateans to Islam, and to Ottoman and Turkish cultural and historical contexts. So I chose these works written in different languages and different styles from among the dozens of others on the topic because they were distinctive. What is distinctive about them is not only that they reconstruct converso history and ask the question of what it means to keep or discover ancestral identity. Just as importantly, whether they're identified as descendants of Jews or not, the authors were drawn to the Spanish Jewish conversion story because of the way it intersects with other stories, particularly with the other histories of exile, persecution, and genocide, including histories of indigenous people in the Americas, Spanish Muslims and Moriscos, and Muslim crypto-Jews, so that these other community stories are intimately connected to the converso ones. I refer to these as to these works as narratives of convergence, in which characters of different backgrounds are fellow victims of racial empire and the Inquisition, with an element of kinship among the Jewish and the non-Jewish characters, further emphasizing these connections that are plausible but really impossible to prove. Fiction that narrates plausible convergences of the past then becomes a remedy for what I called the missing archive of the secret and non-documented converso past and of little-known lives carried out in secrecy. The positioning of conversos as a node in this way also shows that convergences among seemingly discrete worlds can arise not only in freedom but also under oppression. And in the non-fictional family memoirs I examine, Vidal and His Family by Edgar Morin and The Cross and the Pear Tree, A Sephardic Journey by Victor Pereira, the authors recount the journeys of their families, emphasizing Sephardi identity as a crossroads that includes non-Jews and also conversos returning to Judaism outside of Iberia, in narratives that unfold in places like Italy, Salonika, Jerusalem, France, and Guatemala. Morin characterizes the Sephardi experience at the crossroads as a polyenracinement, or polyrootedness. While most modern Sephardic family stories overlook the remote converso past, for which most families have little proof or connection, Morin and Pereira's converso ancestors play a key role as figures of indeterminate subjectivity and multiple belongings, as well as martyrdom. They identify with the converso as an ancestor and as a symbolic figure. Morin and Pereira are not unique in how they draw on the converso figure. The 1990s and 2000s saw a significant deployment of converso history and consciousness by prominent thinkers, especially in France, including, for example, Jacques Derrida, Morin, and Daniel Ben Said, and many others. For many of these thinkers, the converso who hides an identity long out of reach internally and belongs to more than one world is a historical figure that is also an emblem of the condition of modern subjectivity, a subjectivity that's characterized by unreconciled splits, deracination, indeterminacy, and doubt. Engaging with the Sephardi world deeply, I show how Morin and Pereira are also unique in making converso history visible and relevant within a contemporary narrative of the Sephardi world. In other chapters, I also examine how self-division, the internally conflicted self under repression, is represented through fictional characters. For example, in Achille Vejas's Days of Awe, her novel, a central character is torn between Cuban Catholic belonging and the crypto-Jewish family background, even in the 20th century. Or in the Turkish author Elif Shafak's novel, Mirrors of the City, we find that the supernatural appearances of jinns and animated objects express the tormented internal life of the Pereira brothers, who discover their Jewish backgrounds and leave for Italy and the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century, one of them then converting to Sabbatarianism in a life of loss and wandering. In Ternard's novel, Rembrandt's Model 2, the Sabbatarians' lives of secrecy lead to uncanny events. Especially noteworthy in these two works is the subjectivity of the converso who returns to Judaism in the safety of Amsterdam or Istanbul, but cannot resolve the questions of belonging or faith, existing in states of uncertainty. Rather than through inside-outside dichotomies, selfhood is presented in terms of nebulous interiors, secrecy, and doubt persisting long after the dangers are over, which is again a testament to the relevance of the converso figure to our understanding of the self under political repression. A key text that I examined, which not only locates the crypto-Jew in the historical milieu, but also stages the recuperation of converso history and identity in the present, is the 2010 novel, Mi nombre es Jamaica, My Name is Jamaica, for which its Lisbon-based Spanish author, José Manuel Fajardo, won the Alberto Benveniste Prize for literature about the Sephardic world. I will only touch on one aspect of this complex work to demonstrate how it helps us reflect on what it means to recover ancient identities in the current moment. Let me provide you with a very quick summary of the novel. Two Paris-based professors of Sephardic studies who are also friends, Santiago, a Christian Spaniard, and Dana, a French Sephardic Jew, go to Israel for a conference. On a side trip to Safed, to Sfat, Santiago, who's desperately grieving for a son he has just lost, presents with psychosis. In Safed, the ancient home of Kabbalistic Judaism, he, quote unquote, loses his mind and declares himself to be a half Judeo-converso and half indigenous Peruvian warrior of the 17th century, named Jamaica, a historical figure that he has studied and read about. So he makes terrible scenes leading to his arrest and rescue by his colleague Dana. Thereafter, Santiago claims he's Sephardic because he says that as a Spaniard, he must be carrying Jewish blood. As such, Santiago, a sort of contemporary Don Quixote besotted by history instead of by romance novels, also perceives all Jews as eternal victims and all victims as Jews, whether they're Palestinians or Parisian racialized minorities. Any victim is a Jew, just like the windmills were evil knights for Don Quixote. Dana, the Sephardic Jew who serves as his Sancho Panza figure, tells Santiago to stop idealizing. We Jews can be executioners as much as victims, she says. But Santiago rejects her rational plea to abandon his madness and stop recuperating Spain's Jewish past through his own body, which he treats as a remnant of the past. In the Converso's Return, I refer to this, including with respect to other texts, as the production of new remnants. What do I mean by that? I'm referring to the notion that that Santiago is operating on, that something resides in the body and is triggered countless generations later, even in the absence of any direct transmission about what that is. In this case, Jewishness. At this discovery, then, one sees oneself as a remnant of a suppressed past, as this character does. So we think of a remnant as something that has survived. Yet in many imaginative acts reviving the past, remnants of the past are not found, but they're made through various means. Scenes of return to ancient sites, or the representation of embodied symptomatic responses transmitted from the past. This can raise thorny questions about building identity on descent. If Jewishness is quote unquote in the blood and can bypass experience, despite the 500-year gap between one's ancestors and oneself, this can evoke racial discourses. Once a Jew, always a Jew, all the way down the lineage. Santiago, the character, makes manic speeches about the hatred for the inquisitorial hypocrites past and present, sometimes mixing Castilian with Judeo-Spanish as if he were speaking in tongues. Dana shortly loses patience and begins seeing Santiago as a monster of appropriation, with his unearned claiming of other people's pain. For Dana, Santiago has become an imposter whose boundary crossing as a self-proclaimed born-again Jew is not an ethical recovery and restitution of the past, but a violation that effaces and subverts the lived experience of others. Here we enter the turbid waters of authenticity and experience. The novel makes us ask whether history and identity belong only to those who experience their consequences through known kinship ties. What does it mean for a victor, a white Spanish Christian male, to identify as a victim? On the one hand, Fajardo's character challenges the idea of disappearance and extinction by asserting survival and recuperating the violently repressed memory of Jewish blood in the Christian body and Jewish history in Christian Spain today. On the other hand, the presentation of the self as a remnant and the body as a historical artifact can lead to more erasures. Primarily, what is erased is the acknowledgement of incontrovertible absences and unknowables, the fact that we cannot deny disappearances. In positioning Santiago as a delusional character who eventually regains his sanity, Fajardo, the author, exposes the vagaries of trying to undo the history of conversion and persecution through the recuperation of identities. The production of new remnants is often ambiguously and multiply positioned, both challenging ruptures, erasures, and denials of past crimes and traumas, but also sometimes creating new ones. These questions are also relevant with the rise of genetic ancestry testing, which has played a great role in creating new identities, including the contemporary Converso descendant identity. Genetic ancestry testing provided another way in which to produce the body as an archive of the past. For some individuals who change their identification to Jewish, Native American, or African based on results that show up in the inbox, the body is a stable repository of ancient history. The attractiveness of these claims of truth based on genetics is evidenced by the popularity of genetic genealogy as a hobby and TV shows like Henry Louis Gates's Finding Your Roots. The body is treated as an archive, then often substituting for missing knowledge about the ancestral past. The body seemingly has the ability to reveal the truth about oneself, a truth beyond experience or practice. This genetic basis of memory and identification can be problematic in ways that Fajardo and scholars of genetic ancestry testing, like Dorothy Roberts, have signaled. On the other hand, it is also a form persistently calling attention to past atrocities and persecutions that are submerged. And I will conclude now. So one of the animating questions of my project was to find out in what ways the story of secret Spanish or Portuguese Jewish ancestry enriches the present. And on the other side, what might be the pitfalls of restoring history, this history. Returning to an extinct past can trouble current identities by showing their hidden and contradictory sources, but they can also re-solidify them. Narratives of conversion in Jewish Iberia and its diasporas raise our awareness about how the past is not a pre-constituted object, but one that can be made in the present, including through the body. Further, the genealogical preoccupations at the center of the Converso's return are highly relevant to ongoing legal and political framings of citizenship and belonging, as well as the fictional and other narratives of our lives. Quest for the past, then, can generate new narratives that can have surprising social, political, and literary impact. Writing about Converso's multiple worlds forged under duress also opens up the space to offer many other narratives about suffering, survival, and solidarities. What I try to do in my book, as I explained a bit today, is to trace the reasons and consequences of a quest for the past and show something about the social, intellectual, and literary doors we open when we explore Iberian Jewish history and memories, meanings in our own time. So somewhat uncannily for me, our own time is also one in which Iberian Jewish history returned to our consciousness in a material way, impacting hundreds of thousands of lives. A few years before I completed my study, I began with Rina Benmayor, a project that overlapped with the Converso's return in ways that I had never imagined it would. I'll say a bit more about these overlaps later in the event. But for now, let me just briefly introduce the edited volume, Reparative Citizenship, about which Rina is going to talk at length. So as some of you know, in 2015, the Portuguese and Spanish parliaments passed historic laws offering citizenship to descendants of Sephardi Jews who were expelled from Iberia more than 500 years ago. Although for over a century, Spain had had special citizenship dispensations for Sephardi Jews, its new offer, which is now expired, had new allowances and new requirements. In Portugal, the law was novel in the form of an amendment to their standing nationality law. In early 2017, a year after Rina had initiated her own Spanish citizenship application based on her Sephardi identity and descent, she and I launched an oral history project to learn how other applicants were experiencing and reacting to the citizenship offers, and to examine how these laws might affect changing discourses about Sephardism, diasporas, and nationalism. We used Zoom to interview 70 applicants from all over the world, from Europe, the Americas, the Middle East, and even Africa. Presenting on our project at international conferences, we met other scholars who were writing about the laws, but no one had yet published a scholarly book on the topic, or any book for that matter. In the spring of 2020, just as the pandemic hit, we signed a book contract for the edited volume, Reparative Citizenship for Sephardi Descendants, Returning to the Jewish Past in Spain and Portugal. The articles and essays in Reparative Citizenship examine the meanings and histories of the laws, both for the applicants and for the states and institutions involved. The book has 16 chapters, 11 of them are critical articles, and 5 are personal essays. We were really excited about mixing scholarly and testimonial voices, which is an unusual combination in academic books. Another feature is that many of the articles are authored collaboratively, a practice which we as co-editors found particularly enriching. And the book is also multinational and multidisciplinary. Our 21 authors come from Spain, Portugal, Italy, Turkey, Venezuela, the UK, and the US. They're experts in legal studies, history, oral history, political science, anthropology, and literary and cultural studies. The authors of the personal essays are all published writers who provide special reflections on the significance of acquiring this ancestral citizenship. And now, we can turn to Rina, who will elaborate on reparative citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dalia. That was absolutely fantastic talk. For those in the audience, feel free to use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we will get to the discussion after our next talk by Rina Benmayor, Professor Emerita in the School of Humanities and Communication at California State University in Monterey, where she taught oral history, literature, and digital storytelling. Rina served as president of the oral history, ready for slides, and the International Oral History Associations. Her authored, co-authored, and co-edited books include Romances Judeo-Español de Orient, an original collection and study of Sephardic ballads, Latino Cultural Citizenship, Telling to Live, Latina Feminist Testimonios, and Memory, Subjectivities, and Representation, which was the winner of an Oral History Association Book Award. With our previous speaker, as previously mentioned, she co-edited Reparative Citizenship for Sephardi Descendants, and she's currently working on a personal memoir about her Greek Sephardic family. Rina's talk today is entitled The 2015 Spanish and Portuguese Sephardi Citizenship Laws and Their Situated Meanings. Take it away, Rina.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, I have to navigate all these different screens here for just a moment. Okay. So thank you, everybody. I would like to
so Rina, we see your notes
okay.
and not the images.
So I
Maybe put that
share.
one in
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
All right. All right, let me get to where I am. Okay, so I would like to also thank, along with Dalia, Kalman, Julie, David, Grant, our tech person, and the Koshitsky Center and the Wolinsky Lecture Series for inviting us to share our work with you today. It's indeed an honor, and it's very exciting. I've organized this presentation of our book, Reparative Citizenship for Sephardi Descendants, around 4 key questions that people ask and that the book addresses. I'll be drawing on the various chapters of the book to illustrate these points. I should also note that the full introduction to the volume is available online, and I've placed the link in the chat. At some point, you'll be able to have access to that link or to the chat. And there you can see how the book is organized and read detailed descriptions of each section and chapter, along with historical and theoretical discussions that contextualize the laws and their impact. So now I need to get to my share screen, which now I don't know where it is. Too many windows open here. Okay, let me share my screen, and here we go. Did it share? No.
We see a text file, a slide file that says key questions that the book
Yeah. No, this is what I want you to see here. Okay. All right. So the key
can you put this in presentation mode, and then we won't see. Oh, it's fine like that.
Yeah. A little bit complicated here. Okay. So the key questions that the book addresses. Why these laws now after more than 500 years? Dalia also mentioned that in her presentation. Can citizenship be considered a legal reparation? And if not, why the title of our volume, which is Reparative Citizenship? The third question is, why were these laws extended only to the descendants of Sephardi Jews and not to other communities that suffered state-inflicted wrongs in Spain and Portugal? And lastly, why do or did people want these citizenships, and what did they mean to the beneficiaries? What were some of the obstacles, and why did some people refuse the offer? Okay, so oops, that's not what I want here. All right, sorry, navigating. Okay, so for the first question, why these laws now after more than 500 years? Several chapters in the book provide explanations to this question related to the histories of each country and their attitudes toward the Jewish past. In June 2015, right after the law was passed, Spain's King Philip VI addressed the Sephardic community in Spain by saying, quote, "Oh, how we have missed you." He was expressing a long-standing philo-Sephardic discourse that began at the end of the 19th century, when Spanish politicians and scholars rediscovered, quote unquote, Spanish-speaking Sephardi Jews in the Ottoman Empire. Spaniards without a homeland, Senator Pulido called them. This was also a time when Spain's economy and international standing were in shambles after losing the Spanish-American War. This embrace of the Sephardi communities in the Ottoman Empire and North Africa is known as philo-Sephardism, the love of Sephardis, a concept that runs throughout all the chapters in our book. The preamble of the 2015 Spanish law expresses this romantic discourse as in the following passage. You can hear it. Quote, "The children of Sepharad maintained an abundance of nostalgia, immune to the transformation of languages and generations. Pulsating through time is a love for a Spain that is at last aware of the historical and emotional load the Sephardim have carried." Well, you can hear it's pretty obvious. But the 2015 law is not the first time that Spain has made citizenship offers to the Sephardi Jews. As early as the 1840s, it offered consular protections to Sephardi elites in the Ottoman Empire. Devin Nar's chapter in our book examines how the community leaders in Salonika, which was then the capital of Sephardi, the most populated city with Sephardi Jews in the world, how the leaders manipulated Spanish philo-Sephardism to their advantage in order to obtain these legal protections. In 1924, the Spanish crown issued a 6-year royal decree offering nationality to consular protégés or their descendants, as many had been left stateless by the breakup of the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire. There have been other special dispensations at different points in the 20th century, and in 1992, on the occasion of the quincentenary of the expulsion, Spain offered citizenship again, but it required a 2-year residency, and you had to give up your original, the citizenship of your birth. So the 2015 law is unique in that it offers dual citizenship without any territorial residency requirement. But this too was a temporary window with an expiration date of 3 years, which was then extended to 4 as a result of the COVID pandemic. As for why now, the Jewish community leaders that Daniela Flessler and Michal Friedman interviewed for their article refer to the political situations of the Jewish communities in Venezuela and Turkey as the main impetus for the 2015 law in Spain. This fit with the long-standing desires of some Spanish government officials to bring the Sephardi Jews into the nation. Also, in the transition from dictatorship to democracy, Spain enacted a law of historical memory in 2007, recognizing the horrors and the genocide and the granting of rights to the victims of the Civil War and of the Franco dictatorship. As Davide Aliberti points out in his chapter that analyzes the parliamentary debates that led to the passage of the law, the time was right to garner multi-partisan support. In terms of Portugal, the preamble to its law similarly expresses philo-Sephardic sentiments. It praises the Sephardi Jews of Portuguese origin who maintained, quote, the names, language, artifacts, and memories that led them to call themselves Portuguese Jews or Jews of the Portuguese nation, end quote. However, the Portuguese law differed from the Spanish one in that it was an amendment to a standing nationality law and therefore had no expiration date. Isabel David and Anup Corte-Real Pinto argue in their chapter that Portugal's motives had more to do with its economic interests, like tourism, and its image to rebrand the nation as a tolerant and open society, putting the country's colonial history, racist attitudes, and its brutal dictatorial regime in the past. So now I'd like to turn to our second question. Can citizenship be considered a legal reparation? And if not, why the title of our volume? It's important to note that despite wide usage in the press and in parliamentary debates, the terms reparative or reparation are nowhere mentioned in either law. The Spanish text speaks about seeking reconnection and reconciliation. The Portuguese law calls itself a law of return. In fact, as Alfonso Aragoneses explains in the book's lead article, there are no legal precedents for offering citizenship as a form of repair. He emphasizes that, quote, from a formal legal perspective, citizenship cannot be considered a measure of reparation for a crime or historical injustice committed by a country in the past. Neither can a historical injustice in the distant past be repaired from a legal perspective. Because how do you judge how do you pay for the loss of property in the 15th century? Things like that. This is especially true in the absence of a formal apology, which Spain has never issued. Aragoneses distinguishes the Spanish and Portuguese laws from those of Germany, Austria, and Greece, which now offer citizenship restitution to Holocaust victims and also to their descendants. Ghana goes back centuries to offer a right of abode, not citizenship, to descendants of the slave trade. Aragoneses emphasizes, however, that citizenship law has evolved and that the granting of citizenship can also be used as a symbolic mechanism of reparation that can help reshape a country's image and support international diplomacy. Perhaps more importantly, he notes, symbolic reparation can be a tool to foster tolerance and diversity at a time when homogeneous visions of national communities are no longer sustainable. He argues that the gesture to repair an injustice committed in the distant past shows a commitment to the values of democracy and human rights. Essentially agreeing with Aragoneses, Davide Aliberti takes a deep dive into the Spanish parliamentary debates in which the term reparations was widely used orally, although not in a strict legal sense. He examines the concepts of reparations, reparation politics, transitional justice, and reconciliation, as these are understood from the standpoint of international human rights. He points out that the Spanish law intentionally avoided using the term reparation because in legal parlance, the term has other implications, usually material restitution. However, the law does signal the moral and ethical spirit of reparation. He concludes that the law was never conceived under the terms of reparations politics and agrees with Aragoneses in that the reparation should be understood as a significant symbolic gesture. So in titling our book Reparative Citizenship, we intentionally wanted to signal that the meanings of reparation and citizenship have shifted and expanded. The realities of 21st century globalization, the movement of peoples around the world, and the decline of the traditional definitions of national communities require a more malleable concept of state membership that embraces multiple citizenships, extraterritorial nationals, and multiple identities and feelings of belonging. Pairing these two terms, reparation and citizenship, forces the question and suggests new thinking about how countries might acknowledge and heal their historical injustices. It's also interesting that the applicants contribute to these expanded meanings of citizenship and belonging, as in the case of Colette Capriles, a Venezuelan of Sephardi ancestry, born into a family that had become Catholic over the generations, but who proudly embraces her Sephardi identity. She declares herself the recipient not of a Spanish passport, but of a Sephardi one. So the third contribution our book considers is the quote. our book considers is the question of why were these laws extended only to descendants of Sephardi Jews and not to other populations who suffered state-inflicted wrongs? As I pointed out, Spain's nationality law can be understood in the context of the historical memory law, but Spain's official engagement with memory has been differential. In his speech at the inaugural ceremony, King Philip addressed the Sephardi community saying, quote, "Thank you for your loyalty and for keeping as a precious treasure your language and your customs that are not different from our own." In their riveting behind-the-scenes account of the origins and elaboration of the Spanish law, Flessler and Friedman underscore the heavy philo-Sephardism that permeates this story. Through interviews, the key actors recount in their own words the legislation's evolution from the original intention to the resulting law, revealing what Flessler and Friedman call a discourse of rescue, debt, and gratitude. The intention to rescue the Jews of Venezuela and Turkey, feelings of historical debt to the Sephardi Jews for having bankrolled the Catholic monarch's expulsion of the Arabs from the peninsula, and as you can hear in King Philip's words, gratitude accompanied by an appropriation of Sephardic culture, which has developed independently over 5 centuries and in many different places, as, quote, no different from our own. However, the story is different with regard to the descendants of the Moriscos, Moors who had converted to Christianity after 1492, but were then expelled in the 17th century. Several chapters in the book address the question of why they were excluded from the legislation when their historical trajectories are so similar to that of the Sephardi Jews. We learn from Aliberti that the legislative exclusion of descendants of the Moriscos, and also, by the way, of the Sahrawis of Spanish Sahara, was an issue that was raised repeatedly in early parliamentary debates. Elizabeth Bolorino-Salard explains that historical ideologies lie at the heart of this differential treatment of Jews and Arabs, of Jewish and Arab descendants, ideologies that justify the exclusion of the Morisco descendants from citizenship. Whereas philo-Sephardic praises were heaped on Sephardi Jews for preserving Spanish language and cultural traditions, their economic value to the bankrupt Spanish state notwithstanding, after the Spanish colonization of Morocco, the descendants of the Moriscos were viewed through narratives of, quote, primitivism and uplift. In their interviews, Flessler and Friedman confirmed this distinction through a candid quote from the former Minister of Justice, Alberto Ruiz Gallardón, the chief governmental architect of the law. He recounts his response to a deputy in the Spanish Parliament who was advocating for the inclusion of the Moriscos in the legislation. And he says, "Tell me," I said to the deputy, "where can you find a community of Arab citizens who continue to speak Spanish, who maintain Spanish culture, and when you go to their homes, they show you the key where their ancestors lived in Spain? If you can show me that, then we can give those Arabs Spanish citizenship." Well, in response to such attitudes and thinking, Elena Arijita and Laura Galean's chapter on the long-standing struggle of the Morisco Andalusias to gain appropriate recognition in Spain adds an important and a different perspective. They examine the responses from within the Morisco Andalusian community itself, which, as its name indicates, claims historical belonging in the region of Andalusia. The authors explain that what is paramount in the mobilization for justice for Morisco Andalusias is the duty of memory owed to them by Spain. They point out that what the community asks for is not necessarily legal citizenship, but historical, symbolic, and cultural recognition of their past and present belonging in the Spanish nation. So moving to the last question, why want these citizenships and what do they mean to the beneficiaries? What were some of the obstacles and why did some refuse the offer? The final 4 chapters, along with 5 personal essays in the volume, focus on perspectives from the bottom up, from the point of view of the beneficiaries themselves and ourselves. I include myself because I went through the experience and the process of applying and received my passport. We included these 5 personal essays because they offer different insights into the motivations for seeking Spanish or Portuguese citizenship and recount particular experiences along the way. So I'm going to give you a very brief look into each one. I mentioned before how Venezuelan philosopher and political science professor Colette Capriles rebranded her passport as a Sephardi one. But her account also articulates the trajectory of the Portuguese Sephardi community of Curaçao, including religious conversions over the generations and assimilation into Venezuelan culture. Colette also connects her ancestral story with the current political situation her country is undergoing. In the story of a Spanish Dunme, IT professional and fiction writer Uluç Uzuyener, originally from Turkey and living in the United States, received both Spanish and Portuguese passports as a Dunme. A descendant, Dunmes, as Dalia has explained, are descendants of the followers of Sabbatai Tzvi, the 17th century false messiah from Salonika who converted to Islam. The descendants of his followers have kept their Jewish roots hidden over the centuries, transmitting their genealogies throughout generations in oral transmission rather than through documents. This, of course, complicates the process that demands documentation. Mr. Uzuyenar was the first Dunme to acquire Spanish citizenship, and in doing so, paved the way for others to apply. His essay is also part of his effort to bring Dunme identity out into the open. Rita Ender, a lawyer also from Turkey, opens her story by recounting how one day she received an email from the Portuguese lawyer handling her citizenship case saying, "Congratulations, you are Portuguese." She reflects on the meaning of this sudden new identity in the context of growing up in a typical family in the Jewish community of Istanbul. As a lawyer, she also helped others with their application processes, and she contrasts her application experience with that of some of her clients who had to construct much stronger genealogical proof than she did, noting the challenge of building a case based on identity rather than genealogy. In The Fez in the Water, Exile and Return, Victor Silverman, a historian and award-winning filmmaker, offers a thoughtful reflection on citizenship, nationalism, and the legacies of exile. He notes that sometimes politics lead one to not feeling part of any group. However, the history of his family's migration from Izmir to Brooklyn and his love for his ancestral culture led him to join his siblings and cousins in a family application to Portugal, which is still in process. My hope for humanity, he says, and my distrust of nationalisms don't blind me to the emotional significance of national citizenship. The law promises my family and me that we can become part of something that we told ourselves we had lost. Finally, Ruth Behar, a noted anthropologist, essayist, and writer of young adult fiction, recounts a very different experience in her essay titled Sepharad Postponed. Born in Cuba and a U.S. citizen, she approached the application with trepidation, and then finally was unable to complete her application process due to the COVID pandemic. She was unable to travel to Spain to sign her application. Her initial feelings of fear turned to disappointment upon encountering these bureaucratic hurdles. She concludes that perhaps the law falls short of its goal of real reparation. And I should say, apropos of Ruth's essay, that the processes have posed obstacles to other applicants. The process was long, requiring a level of genealogical documentation that most families do not have, the need to take a language and a culture exam for Spain, getting every genealogical document notarized, apostilled, and officially translated, obtaining certification of one's Sephardi ancestry from a rabbi or Jewish community in the place where one lives, and also by the Jewish communities in Spain and Portugal. And in the case of Spain, you had to go and sign your application in person before a Spanish lawyer. So those were some of the obstacles that everybody talks about. Along with the personal narratives I just summarized, 4 articles in the book's final section also engage personal narratives in the form of oral histories, ethnographic participant observation, formal interviews, and a netnography of social media entries on the internet. In his article, anthropologist Charles MacDonald addresses the response that many beneficiaries have articulated, which is, why would I want citizenship in a country that expelled us? In his chapter, MacDonald elaborates on this counter-narrative. He explores the politics of refusal through in-depth conversations with 3 potential applicants who raised concerns such as the ethics of legitimizing this law by applying for it, the superficiality of the law and the lack of supporting educational resources to combat anti-Semitism, which still exists in Spain as it does everywhere, a lack of effective attachment to Spain, and discomfort with the philo-Sephardic essentializing of Sephardi Jews as Spanish. From the perspective of refusal, the law, MacDonald says, is better understood as a gift rather than a true act of reparation or reconciliation. An innovative contribution to this section is Marina Pignatelli's ethnography of the virtual online communities of Brazilian applicants on Facebook and YouTube. Brazilian descendants of New Christians comprise the bulk of the applications to Portugal, followed in numbers only by Israelis, as Teresa Santos and Heraldo Bento document in the appendix to Pignatelli's article. In fact, Latin Americans of Converso or New Christian descent probably comprise 2/3 of all applicants to both Spain and Portugal. The numbers don't differentiate between conversos and Sephardi Jews, cultural Sephardi Jews like myself. Anyway, Pignatelli details how these virtual communities serve the function of sharing practical information, supporting each other in their quests, and imparting expectations and reactions upon receiving citizenship. She argues that these social media communities facilitate the creation of Sephardiness amongst Brazilian descendants of New Christians. Overall, the narratives of applicants or potential beneficiaries overturn some of the assumptions and reveal some expected and unexpected responses. Most, especially among young people, who see this citizenship offer in practical terms. A European community passport opens the doors for wider travel without the need for special visas. It offers the opportunity to live, work, or study in Spain, Portugal, or in any of the EU countries. And there are some who have gone to live in Spain and Portugal, and others who have no intention to relocate, but who value this citizenship in symbolic terms as a connection to the past and a reclaiming of rights that were taken away centuries ago. Both Dalia and my articles, which are in this section, are based on the extensive oral history project we conducted that Dalia has already referred to, with 70 applicants. Dalia's article explores the motives and experiences among conversos, and now I'm going to turn the screen over to her, so she's going to tell you a little bit about her chapter, and then I will say a few words about mine and offer a very brief conclusion. So, Dalia?
Thanks, Rina. So my chapter in this book is called Descendants of Conversos in the Americas, the Ancestral Past, Sephardi Identity, and Citizenship in Spain and Portugal. It's based on 17 of the 70 oral histories with the applicants that Rina and I had collected. These 17 narrators are descendants of conversos to Christianity and of early modern settlers in the Americas, some of whom have already received Spanish or Portuguese citizenship, not all. Converso descendants did not figure in the original conception of the laws, particularly in Spain, and according to our authors, our findings, our own findings. The communities in mind for the Spanish state and the Portuguese were normative Sephardi Jews who have maintained their identities And the preambles of the laws spoke to them. You heard from Rina the flowery language in the preamble about how the children of Sepharad have been maintaining a wealth of nostalgia and so on. They add that the nostalgia is materialized in the conservation of Ladino or Judeo-Spanish and Haketia as an original, and I'm quoting, as original Spanish enriched with linguistic loans of various host languages. The Sephardi Jews, maintained the customs and respected the names that so often invoked their origin and accepted their new situation without resentment, cultivating longing and love for Spain. That's the end of the quote. And so we can see that we can see that loyalty is a key factor in the discursive constitution of the law and is a basis of the philo-Sephardism. It's perceived as a mutual thing, that there's a love of Sephardi Jews for Spain, and now the love is reciprocated. On this basis, then, the descendants of conversos who grew up in Christian communities mostly, far from Sephardi or other Jewish diasporas, without the kind of transmission of Jewish languages and customs that are spelled out in the preamble. And so they're not included in the Spanish imagination that led to the creation of the law. However, they were still eligible because nationality laws prohibit discrimination on religious basis. And the proof that's necessary is not one's own Sephardi Jewish identity, but that of one's ancestors. And that's what I call the genealogical imperative of the law. So you just need to find a remote ancestor, and that can be sufficient to prove Sephardi descent, rather than Sephardi identity in the present. So on that basis, tens of thousands of Latin Americans and US Latinos mobilized genealogists and historical research in order to find 16th or 17th century ancestors who were from known converso families. So in fact, we can safely guess, like Rina also mentioned, that the majority of applicants from Latin America are not Jewish identified, but applied as descendants of conversos. We can show you numbers later on if you're interested. The narrators I wrote about are originally from Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, and the United States. Most did not know about their Sephardic ancestry before the enactment of the 2015 laws, but 6 among them had known and had formally converted to Judaism well before 2015. They're part of the phenomenon that I refer to as the return of the converso. To present themselves as descendants of Sephardic Jews to the states of Spain and Portugal, all of the narrators that we spoke to had to do research on their lineage that dates back usually to the 16th century, that is to the time of the conquest and the establishment of settlements in the Americas, mostly in northern Mexico. What I show in this chapter is that discoveries of Jewish ancestors lead to new knowledge, but also new conceptions of identity and belonging. So instead of this loyalty and continuity presumed by other official discourses, these narrators emphasize ruptures and losses due to an identity, religion, and belonging repressed for long centuries under the Inquisitions and other repressions. They speak about how they were denied the right to know, and how, as one narrator from Mexico said, now they're catching up with lost time by learning and even converting to Judaism, although that's a minority. Moreover, in light of what they learn, some begin to perceive the history of their own local and national contexts in Mexico, Brazil, or the Caribbean in a new light, as stories full of secrets, martyrdoms, and repressed belongings, rather than the more common narrative of migration to the Americas, the dominant ones of which narrate the Christian ones from the Iberian Peninsula and elsewhere. As a reinterpretation takes place in some returns to the past, the integration of conversos in personal lineages and in regional and national narratives, contest the origin of Spaniards in the Americas as purely Christian. For some of the narrators, it also questions a totalizing Christian victory over non-Christians. In addition to developing a new relationship with their origins on the continent and sometimes engaging in collective memory activism, many also have changed their own personal stories to insert a Sephardic belonging, as well as a new relationship with Spain and Portugal, not via an Iberian conquistador or settler perspective, but on the basis of Jewishness. Finally, among some narrators, we see a new conception of Sephardic Judaism that is based on genealogy. A separate category of identification emerges where one can be Sephardi without being Jewish, in the formulations of some of the narrators, which raises questions about Sephardiness and Jewishness itself. Overall, this chapter shows that ancestral citizenships that aim to repair the past and restore old belongings can produce for potential beneficiaries unexpected new identifications, new definitions of community, and a new historical consciousness. So back to you, Rina, for the description of your own chapter.
Okay. My chapter is titled Affective Citizenship and Iberian Sephardi Descendants. So citizenship is generally not studied from the point of view of emotions. My chapter intends to add something new to this conversation. I developed this work based in part on Spain's presence in my own life and my own application experience and the oral histories that Dalia and I conducted with the applicants from all over the world. So to explain why I see citizenship in emotional or affective terms, I'm making 3 points. My first point is that citizenship and nationality are not fixed or stable concepts in the experience of those of us who seek legal status. Educational scholar Michalinos Zembilas points out that citizenship can function as a, quote, form of felt identity. So how do Sephardi applicants feel their identities? And now to answer that, I'm going to play for you a short clip of one of the, where is my, okay, a short clip, here we go. From Marcelo Benveniste, who is from Argentina. And you'll see the translation at the bottom of the screen.
A mí me emociona que una decisión tomada por el Estado español, por el gobierno español en este caso.
Wait, there is no translation at the bottom? Okay, well.
Me una con esos antepasados de 600 años atrás. Y pensar que yo estoy haciendo hoy un trámite que lo hago porque mi tatarabuelo vivió allí. Y entonces esa historia que tanto vivimos y de la que participaron toda una cadena de antepasados hasta llegar a mí, yo también estoy formando parte de esa historia, yo formo parte de esa cadena. Y a mí tener esa mirada hasta algo romántica, me gusta tenerla. Yo no estoy pensando en ir a vivir a España, no tengo la menor intención. Adoro España, me encanta, fui muchas veces y me encanta España, pero no tengo pensado en vivir a España ni remotamente. Pero el hecho de ser parte de una historia que siempre me apasionó, bueno, eso realmente me gusta mucho, me hace sentir muy bien.
Okay. It's asking me to confirm my language. Okay, let me just summarize what Marcelo said. He said, I'm moved when I think that a decision made by the Spanish government unites me with my forebears of 600 years ago, and that I can apply for citizenship because my great-great-great-great-grandfather lived in that time, making me part of that ancestral chain. To be part of that history that always fascinated me, well, I like that very much. It makes me feel very good. And that's just a summary of what he said. Others, like Marcelo, express a range of sentiments, like the desire to honor the family, a sense of nostalgia and cultural memory, a love for Judeo-Spanish, the language and the culture, curiosity among those who have lost contact with their Sephardi heritage and are excited about discovering their roots. Those who live in politically unstable situations speak about fear and the need for options. Some speak about physical return migration to live in Spain and Portugal. Younger applicants often speak about the instrumental desire to travel, work, or study in the European Union. So nostalgia, fear, excitement, desire, and other emotions permeate these interviews. My second point is about cultural memory. Following the argument made by feminist thinker Sara Ahmed, who writes that, quote, "It is the very intensity of emotions that ties the individual to their communities of belonging." For Sephardi descendants of all ages and diasporic locations, the story of the is not just a mere historical fact, but a central cultural memory that continues to produce feelings. These feelings of collectivity and belonging lie at the core of the decision to seek or not seek Spanish or Portuguese nationality. My third point is that in destabilizing the concept of citizenship and kindling historical and genealogical emotions, these laws have produced something that the states did not anticipate. Rather than, or perhaps along with, forging new identities as Spaniards or Portuguese, the laws have produced a strong affirmation of Sephardi identity. And here again, Colette Capriles' example comes to mind. So the philo-Sephardic intention of these laws to bring Sephardi descendants into the nation state in reality has produced a different kind of citizenship. So I think that reading citizenship as affective helps us better understand this different meaning of legal identity and belonging in a transnational and globalized world. So that's a synopsis of my chapter, which uses a lot of oral histories. So now I'm just going to take a few minutes to wrap up, to conclude the presentation of our book. So let me briefly summarize a few key contributions that we feel the book has made and the questions it raises for future inquiry. Reparative citizenship brings together several areas of study that are often treated separately: the study of citizenship, memory, diasporas, Iberian Jewish and Muslim history, and contemporary politics in Spain and Portugal. It also offers a multi-level study of nationality and citizenship through both analytical and experiential perspectives at the level of the state, the communities, and individual seekers. In fact, the book as a whole is an argument for maintaining in conjunction top-down and bottom-up perspectives in the study of citizenship and historical repair. The book also advances our understanding of inclusion and exclusion within historical and new citizenship regimes, in which non-territorial membership plays a new role. It also highlights the importance and power of collective memory and the politics of reconciliation in addressing historical injustices. The authors in this volume trace relevant events and discourses over time to help us understand the role of historical crimes in the modern reinventions of Spain and Portugal's national identities. It's remarkable that the ideological and practical apparatuses of these citizenship laws continue to rest on narratives of expulsion, diaspora, empire, and state reformation at different historical periods. Philo-Sephardism, invented more than 100 years ago, continues to serve as the state as a redemptive core. However, as many of the chapters show, at all times, such dominant narratives have been subjected to negotiation and contestation by communities and individuals. This book also makes a contribution to Jewish studies, to Iberian studies, and to Sephardic studies. Its mere existence helps expand a much-needed awareness of the Sephardi experience within Jewish studies. It takes into account both normative and non-normative Sephardi identities maintained in diaspora. In today's world, it's important to understand the non-homogeneous nature of identities that are rendered static or invisible in official discourses. The book also highlights the role of the Iberian states in the construction of Sephardi history and belonging, as well as the role of Sephardism in shaping Spanish and Portuguese national identities. Nationality for Sephardi descendants is an incomplete project that has a long history in Spain and Portugal, as well as an uncertain future. Our book, Reparative Citizenship, captures a moment in time. Since the book appeared in January of last year, the Spanish law, which had a 4-year window, expired in 2021. More recently, there have been significant changes to the Portuguese law that restrict the eligibility of any new applicants by imposing a 2-year residency requirement and the need to prove a long-standing and ongoing relationship with Portugal, that you travel back and forth all the time, that you have property, etc. At the same time, and somewhat ironically, the architects of the Spanish legislation have publicly declared their wish for a permanent nationality law for Sephardi descendants. So the story of these laws may or may not have sequels. It also remains to be seen what recipients will do with their citizenships. Will they go and live in Spain or Portugal, like some have? Will they use their passports to go live in other EU countries? Will they vote in national elections? Will they vote from abroad? Or will their passports become symbolic mementos of a historical right restored? More widely, will there be an expansion beyond the Iberian Peninsula of non-residential citizenship as a mode of symbolic reparation, reincorporation, and reconciliation? And what will the practices and meanings generated by these What will be the practices and meanings generated by these new citizenship regimes? These are just a few of the areas that these unique laws signal for future scholarship and writing. We hope this volume acts as a springboard for such inquiries into the significance of offering citizenship as a form of repair. So with that, I think we go into our Q&A session, and I'll turn the screen back to David.
Rina, thank you so much. Thank you both actually for really incredible talks. They were totally fascinating and covered such incredible range. It is time for the Q&A. I'm going to read, there's some that have come in. I'll remind everyone in the audience who's joined us that you can type in your questions using that little Q&A button that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will read out your questions for you. Okay, let's start with the one question. There's a couple of questions about researching, ancestry. One guest, Maria Almeida, said that her family is from Brazil and her last names are Pereira Dias as well as Almeida. She's been researching her family history for 10 years and has found some possibility of being Sephardi descent. She'd like to know how her family can do the genetic tracing. Her father used to say that her grandparents talked about being from Turkey, but were rooted in Portugal. And then a similar question is from João Eduardo Pereira Gonzalez, pardon me, who says that his family, his great-grandfather migrated to Brazil from Braga, Portugal, and he's found records of his families at the Portuguese Synagogue of Amsterdam and in the Portuguese Synagogue in Izmir. And he'd like to know how we could find the link between his great-grandfather and those relatives. So I was hoping I could just broaden this question to maybe offer some of our guests some tips or links, perhaps, to get going further on their genealogical quests. And if you have any practical advice about those who still may be interested in applying for citizenship, or is this a the ship has set sail on this and that's a no-go? So maybe I'll ask for those for the get-go.
Well, the ship has sailed. From my understanding, I mean, there is no way to apply for Spain right now. And in terms of Portugal, if you are submitting a new application, you are subject to the new requirements. But if you can show, that you have a long-standing relationship with Portugal, that your family, continually go back and forth, maybe you can, qualify. But the I would suggest that maybe these two people look at Marina Pignatelli's article and the ethnography that she produced, because there are all these links to, and she cites them in the article, to this online community that and where people are, sharing their experiences and resources and links and all sorts of things. So that article in the book might be very helpful to them.
Great. I have put the link to both of the books that were the two new books that were mentioned in the chat, so anyone can just click on it. I would recommend you click on the link now, because after the Zoom meeting is over, you won't be able to find it, but it'll open up a new browser. The web page will be there with the book, and then you can follow up later on it, or you can just cut and paste the title of the book as well and see if you can find it on other vendors as well.
Yeah, the particular article that I'm referring to is not available for free. I mean, you do have to buy the book. You can buy the ebook; it's cheaper. But yeah, that would be a source to go to. Maybe Dalia has some other ideas.
I mean, that's what I was going to say, because the online communities provide so much help to one another, whether it's for citizenship, which is now no longer so relevant, but also for finding relatives, finding sources. I mean, this is, this is one really important road. And then the other one is, of course, to hire a genealogist, a researcher. And there are many of those, both in the Americas and in the UK, and I think in Israel. So that's the other route, but that's the costly route. Yeah.
Another guest, Yitzhak Kerem, has asked, he says, does King Carlos's apology for the expulsion that happened in 1992, was this not considered a formal apology? He's curious.
No.
That's a really good question, actually. So this is when King Juan Carlos made a historic speech at a Madrid synagogue. I believe he had a kippah on his head, and he basically set the groundwork for the new citizenship law, inviting Jews back to their home, Sephardic Jews back to their home. But he did not make a formal apology, and so that was noted. But it was still considered, it is a historic speech, and in fact, one of the chapters in our book refers to this speech, the chapter by Elena Arejita and Laura Gallian. And also, if you've probably seen the volume by Daniela Flessler and Adrián Pérez Melgoza, they do an analysis of this speech in their book, The Memory Work of Jewish Spain. But yeah, it's not considered an actual apology.
Portugal did issue a formal apology in the 1980s, I think. I think it was Suarez was the president at that time, and so their politics have been a little cleaner in that respect, Yeah.
I have two practical questions. Dalia, you mentioned being able to share some numbers. I was curious about how many people in total have applied or received citizenship to either country. I know that you said there's been tens of thousands who sort of started in on the research or on the process, and that lots were from, 2/3 were from Latin America. But I wonder if you have a breakdown or a basic breakdown of kind of who's applying, how many people.
Yeah, let me share my screen.
Thank you.
To do that.
The Spanish government does post the results of the applications on a 6-month basis. Every 6 months they publish numbers. The Portuguese government does not, so it's really hard for us to to find any concrete numbers for Portugal.
So so if you can see here,
can you make that a little bigger?
Yeah.
Thanks.
How's that?
Great.
Bigger.
Okay. So you can see here that 150,000, this is unfortunately not the most up to date, but it's the most up to date that we could find. So it's dates from a year ago now. 153,000 were received.
Wow.
And 88,000 have been processed, 80,000 have been resolved, and then about 7,000 were denied. About Latin America, why we're saying that most likely most of the applicants are not Sephardic Jews or Sephardic Jewish identified is because we're looking at, Argentina, Colombia with 21,000 applicants. There are not 21,000 Jews in Colombia. There may be a few thousand, under 5. And then, of course, Mexico with 26,000 applicants, right? And then, of course, Panama has 2,000, Peru has 1,000. So adding all those up, we cannot, as Rina mentioned, we cannot say, who among them is a self-identified Jew and who is not, because the numbers will never tell us that. But we can just take a guess based on existing population in Latin America. Does that help?
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. I wonder if these stats have posed any challenges to Jewish demographers. Have they responded to this? Like, there could be a lot of people who maybe haven't been sort of numbered or captured just in terms of the global number of Jews.
Well, I mean, these don't necessarily tell you the global number of, the number
of course they don't.
Country.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, no, I don't know of any that have done that kind of research. But and then the number of Jews in each country is going to be more difficult to. I mean, you can't really determine whether they're Sephardic or Ashkenazi. So that's another breakdown that But
another attendee, an anonymous one, asked about how the book's been received in Spain and Portugal, and has it sparked any controversy? You could also probably close this the share screen.
Well, that's a really good question. We don't know.
We don't know yet. We did a book launch. We did a book launch in Spain, well, over Zoom, but it was a Spanish origin book launch. And we know that there's some interest in the topic, but our book has not been translated. And so we have not had, we were hoping to have a review in a scholarly journal soon in Spain. So I think it's, with academic books, response is slow, but we have not been reviewed in the mainstream press, right? So, and the other academic responses come much slower, like molasses. So it's going to be a while. But we would love to, in fact, disseminate the ideas in the book and the book itself in Spain and Portugal more. We have given talks there, and we've always been very well received with a lot of interest, which is one of the reasons why we decided to do the book in the first place, because we had started by presenting on our oral histories. So there's definitely interest, but the book's been out a year, and we haven't gotten a response yet from Spain and Portugal. It's also post-pandemic. Post-pandemic, there's not enough reviewers, enough responses. So if you know of any reviewers, please please encourage them to review the book.
A question to you, Dalia, from Ezra Kano. He says, can you please speak again about the two driving questions of your research? He believes you said that one was, how's the Jewish present enriched by the Converso's return? And the second was, what are some of the potential pitfalls of reclaiming an ancient remote identity? Are those the two animating questions? And he says, gracias.
Thank you so much. Yes, great note taking. Those were the questions. At least two of the main ones. And what I meant by that, in what ways does the story of Spanish or Portuguese Jewish ancestry enrich the present, right? What does it do, right? And I'm hoping that I answered that in part, at least in the book, in explaining about, first of all, how the Converso story reinserts itself into the larger Sephardi story, from which it is absent in a kind of popular way. Of course, historians know, and anybody who does research knows. But I think that there's much more of a consciousness of Converso history and existing Converso descendants, by the 100,000s, within the Sephardi and the Jewish world. And in fact, there's I've been to events. It was before the pandemic, where the Jewish organizations invited, were trying to make bridges with Latino organizations, and it was on the basis of Converso history and Sephardi descent, and so it's actually been mobilized politically in that way in order to build bridges in the United States. Of course, the knowledge of Converso Jews, the knowledge about them, and people's actual kind of return and identification with Converso Jews. Also, as I said about some of the narrators, kind of revises how people see their own histories, right? So the Sephardic Jewish story and the Converso story kind of insert themselves into other stories in the Americas, for example, and in Spain and Portugal, in a way that had been occluded, it had been neglected. So those stories come to the fore, and it's a whole other way of looking at the origins of settlement and of families in the Americas. So there's an expansion in that way. And then those are just some of the reasons. I said that there's an enriching factor. But on the other side, though, about the pitfalls, of course, what I mentioned with reference to Fajardo's novel, in which the character just kind of claims identity without having experienced it, or without having been transmitted it in a way that kind of fixes that identity as if it was transmitted through the blood, and which gives rise to sort of genetic and even racial kind of understanding of identity, that it can be passed down through the blood. People talk about sort of feeling Jewish or looking Jewish, even though they have no kind of other connection to Jewish identity or community life. And that's, that in itself is not problematic, but to create identities based on this transmission of blood through the lineage can raise the specter of racial discourses. So those are some of the I would say the main pitfall that I think Fajardo and others kind of warn about.
I got two last questions. I'm mindful that we've been on for a while. One is from Eli Zaidi, who is curious about the cost of the application process, particularly from Latin America, and anecdotally wants to share that some potential applicants in Canada have said that the whole thing was a cash grab, and that it could cost many thousands of dollars. And I guess we're a little bit suspicious of the entire process.
Well, in terms of Spain, it's a moot point because there is no there is no avenue to apply at this.
Oh, Rina, you froze.
Not have to engage a lawyer. You did it online, they uploaded their documents, etc. But I, for example, engaged a lawyer because I didn't know anything about these procedures, and I didn't know what an apostille was, and so for me, it was just easier, and the lawyer just gave me, step 1, step 2, step 3, and so that was it. But For Spain, you had the added expense of having to go there to sign your application. So if you didn't want to take a vacation to Spain, it was an additional cost. There were people who did it for $1,000, just paying the fees and doing it themselves. It could have, if you add in a trip, it could have come to $5,000. But the actual fees for getting your certificate, for paying for the exams that you had to take, those were minimal. They weren't significant. Maybe a couple of $100 total. For Portugal, I don't know. Because in Portugal, you do not have to travel to Portugal to submit an application. And so I would imagine that for the descendants of conversos, the real cost is in putting together your dossier, because they have to submit, they have to find the ancestor in the 15th, 16th century or whatever, who had a Sephardi identity, and then they have to trace every single generation. They have to, it has to be documented, like marriages, births, deaths, all of that has to be documented throughout all of these centuries. That costs a lot of money to do, and that a genealogist can do for you, maybe, but the other way is to find records in the Catholic Church, which does keep baptismal records and all of that. But, you'd have to have known exactly where the family lived. And then you have to do all that tracing yourself. So that's a huge monumental effort.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating.
And there's the irony of that, so many people do find their records either on their own or through the genealogist in the Catholic Church, and it's the Catholic Church that's helping them get, Jewish citizenship.
Will successful applicants who gain citizenship to either of these countries, will their children automatically become citizens, remain citizens?
No. The Spanish law, which is the one I know best in terms of that, you could include minor children in your own application. Or if you were a grandparent, you could do it for your minor grandchildren. But my understanding is that in Portugal, you had to submit separate applications. And then, of course, if you're beyond the age of 18, then you'd have to do it yourself, kind of a separate application. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, and the last question, I squeezed that one in, but the last one that came from the Q&A is from James K, who's curious specifically about Jews who escaped to North Africa and then eventually migrated to Israel, taking up, the process of applying for citizenship. I suppose maybe wants to know something specific about that trajectory and what it might mean, or how many, I don't know if he's curious about how many people or what it might mean to be applying for citizenship via Israel.
Yeah, we didn't interview those people, and we don't know numbers of like how many, let's say, Moroccan Americans or Moroccan Israelis, Canadians applied, but I know they did. I mean, I know that just from people I know. And we interviewed Turkish Jews who settled in Israel. I wouldn't say they escaped, and I don't know if the Moroccans think of themselves as escapees either, but they settled in Israel, and then they were hoping to get Israeli citizenship and Spanish or Portuguese. We also interviewed an Israeli descendant of Turkish Jews who was an Israeli himself. So yes, so there are many routes, right, in this journey that people take. Yeah.
I'm going to add one more actually, because one came in, a late breaking one about Ashkenazi Jews who applied, since this guest said that it's also aware that several hundred Ashkenazi Jews applied for Portuguese citizenship. So is this entirely about Sephardic Jews or Ashkenazim as well?
Laws are entirely about Sephardic Jews. However, there's the very famous case of, the Russian magnate. What's his name? I can't remember his name. Abramovich, who applied for Portuguese citizenship and was granted it. Based on based on a grandmother and some very, very thin evidence of Sephardi belonging. So I don't know.
Interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
Dalia and Rina. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there were Ashkenazi applicants, so I'm not sure, Yitzhak, thank you for your question, what you mean exactly by the Ashkenazi applications. But there are people from Ashkenazi families whose last names are Ashkenazi who have been integrated into the Sephardi communities for many generations, whether in Turkey or somewhere else. And I do know some of them who have gotten it, but we did not study the Ashkenazi applicants. And then, of course, there are lots of people who are not pure anything. They're half Ashkenazi, they're half Christian. So we did interview people with many people with Ashkenazi parents, if not, or one parent will be Ashkenazi or one grandparent, but we didn't interview just sort of purely Ashkenazi identified people, although we know of people who are looking for those roots, right? Ashkenazi people looking for Iberian roots for one reason or another. And the Moroccan Jews in Israel are among the applicants, but we don't know the numbers.
It's
Dalia and
also
Rina, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I'm going to say it's also interesting that for people like myself and Dalia who come from, our backgrounds come from the Ottoman Empire, we can't produce documents because there just aren't any. Whereas the descendants of Converso many times have more possibility of being able to trace their ancestry through genealogy because of the Catholic Church. And so it's kind of interesting that we weren't asked, as Sephardi identified, through our families and backgrounds, we aren't asked to present, how many generations back. I can't go back until, I know the names of grandparents that maybe great-grandparents that come from the 19th century, but that's about as far as I can go with names, it's like, there are no, records. Yeah.
Thank you both, Dalia and Rina. These are fascinating papers, and they look to be absolutely incredible books. I will remind everyone that there are links for them in the chat. And wonderful Q&A. I really appreciate you both coming out, and I appreciate the rest of our audience who stayed till the very end for all the Q&A. The video will be up within a few days on our YouTube channel. And we were very, very pleased to present this year's 2024 Wolinsky Lectures with your very, very fascinating comments. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here.